All right. So I want to make sure that folks out in Zoom land can hear us. Kathy Warren, if you can hear me, can you give me a thumbs up? Oh, look at that. Thanks, Kathy. All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us this evening. My name is Dulcie Kirsting-Lark, and I am so pleased to welcome folks here in the Kenworthy to our event, as well as a number of folks over Zoom. You know, the pandemic is wearing on all of us, but we've all become very adept at things like Zoom, and I think it's great that we can have people in both places attending tonight. So just to make sure you're all in the right place, you are at the How It's Going, How It Started program, part 4, offered by the Latah County Historical Society. This program is also made possible by a generous grant from the Idaho Humanities Council, and really from a lot of help and hard work from our speaker tonight, Dr. Jesse Spohnholz, and his colleagues in the Roots of Contemporary Issues program at Washington State University, which is, if you're not familiar, a freshman program. All incoming freshmen at WSU take this class, and it's a really great way to orient them to the value of history, to primary sources. I had the good fortune of being a teaching assistant many years ago when I was in graduate school with this program. And from that time on, I really wanted to see it as a program offered to the general public. So this has been in the works for a long time, and I'm so glad that we've been able to do 4 installments thus far, 3, 4th being tonight. We do have a 5th program on March 22nd, which will be about a very timely topic, pandemics. And that will be with a professor who used to be at Washington State University, is now in California, and we'll be really excited to have him join us here on the Palouse. So I do have my notes for Dr. Spohnholz here. Also, I just want to say a quick thank you to our friends here at the Kenworthy Performing Arts Center, which have been so gracious in setting up this multi-format event for us so many times now. They are old pros, and we're really grateful to work with them. So our speaker tonight is Dr. Jesse Spohnholz. He's a professor of history at Washington State University and director of the History for the 21st Century Project of the World History Association. For 10 years, he served as director of the Roots of Contemporary Issues program at WSU, out of which grew the book series that is the basis for these lectures. He's published 5 books and more than 24 articles on the history of refugees during the period historians call the early modern era, 16th to 18th century. He just submitted his 6th to a press last month. His talk this evening is drawn from material from a chapter of his most recent book, Ruptured Lives, Refugee Crises in Historical Perspectives, published by Oxford University Press last year, and which you see up on the screen. So please, everybody, help me welcome Dr. Spohnholz.
Thank you, the Latah County Historical Society, and to Dulcie Kirsting-Lark for organizing this panel series. The talk, as Dulcie said, the talk that I'm about to give comes from the book that came out last year about refugee crises in world history. The book is organized around what I call big ideas, that is, large assumptions about human geography that shape some of the ways in which we organize our lives that can help us understand refugee movements and refugee crises. This chapter comes from chapter 2, which deals with the idea of America. Other chapters deal with other main ideas in human geography. Last fall, as the Delta variant of COVID-19 was surging across the Palouse, across the United States, and the rest of the world, our news feeds were also flooded with reports of yet another so-called refugee crisis. Refugee crisis along the southern border of the United States. We watched as the humanitarian disaster unfolded. Thousands of desperate refugees slept for months under the international bridge that connects Ciudad Acuña in the Mexican state of Coahuila in from Del Rio in Texas. At the time, it was hard for me not to recoil in disgust at the sights of white cowboy-looking border guards on horses treating the long-suffering refugees as cattle to be rustled up. I will note, however, that almost all the photos, these compromising photos, were of the same man over and over, another example of the press emphasizing a story that fits a preconceived narrative. At the same time, Haitians in Mexico fleeing Brazil, I wondered, what's going on here? It turns out that the events along the Rio Grande River were just one episode in a massive out-migration of refugees from Haiti in 2021, following a political crisis after the assassination of their prime minister, an economic collapse caused by a massive 7.2 magnitude earthquake and a devastating tropical storm. People were on the brink, and Haiti was already the poorest country in North America. Some 1.5 million people were left homeless. Hundreds of thousands of people fled to Chile and Brazil, but were later driven out due to COVID-related economic crisis. Over 210,000 fled north to Honduras and El Salvador and Mexico. These numbers are actually hard to know for sure for two reasons. First, it's hard to track them through the jungles and makeshift shelters across many countries. And second, the news media was focusing on telling what they told us was the more important story about the cowboy on the horse and a relatively small number, 14,000 or so, who arrived on the US-Mexico border seeking asylum in the US. Indeed, in the United Nations High Commission for Refugees reports that there are some 26 million refugees worldwide. The larger group of these, some 6.7 million, have fled war and violence in Syria, most of whom still live in large-scale camps in Turkey and Lebanon, like this one. Others have fled Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Myanmar, like these Rohingya in Bangladesh, in the face of economic collapse, ethnic violence, and war. In the United States, though, discussions tend to be rather myopic in their understanding of the causes, consequences, and significance of refugees. In fact, while we have played a major role in sparking conflicts that have created millions of refugees fleeing places like Afghanistan and Iraq, the US plays a relatively small role in resettling refugees. Last year, only 11,000, most of whom had already worked for the United States for years. And too often, history gets wielded as a rhetorical wet bludgeon to promote a particular policy towards asylum seekers. In the midst of the US withdrawal from the 20-year long occupation of Afghanistan in August 2021, Fox News commentator Tucker Carlson said, quote, "If history is any guide, and it's always a guide," he said, "we will see many refugees from Afghanistan resettle in our country in the coming months, probably in your neighborhood, and over the next decade, that number may swell to the millions. So first we invade," Carlson quipped, "and then we're invaded," end quote. I'm not entirely sure what history he was talking about, but the most likely culprit are the refugees who came to the US after the withdrawal from Vietnam in 1973, the so-called boat people. Of course, in that case too, there were racist and xenophobic fears that toward refugees who had suffered as a result of the US invasion of that country. And in that case too, the vast majority of the refugees never came to the United States, and those who did were not only peaceable, but became key positive contributors to American society and culture. But supporters of refugee resettlement are no less prone to invoke history to serve their cause. In 2019, as President Donald Trump decreased the number of refugees granted asylum by 50%, even for those who had served as diplomats, translators, and intelligence operators for the US for years. Senator Ed Markey from Massachusetts tweeted that, quote, "America was founded by refugees. We should not close our borders, our shores, or our hearts to them." During that same debate, Democratic politician from Texas, Beto O'Rourke, also tweeted that, quote, "America was founded by refugees." Now, I may appreciate their tone and message as more compassionate and humane than Carlson's, but I still offer an alternative and I think more accurate historical perspective. The tendency of Americans to understand contemporary issues like refugee crises by narrowly focusing on our border, our culture, our values, and our history is certainly understandable. We don't get much access to other perspectives after all, and as the wealthiest and most powerful country in world history, we don't have to. But for the rest of my talk today, I'd like to offer what I think is some useful historical perspective on refugees in American history, and I think can help us cut through some of the political rhetoric of our day. So to start my story, let's begin with the origins of America. In 1492, of course, Christopher Columbus did not discover America. Now, I don't just mean that he always thought he landed in Asia, did, or that millions of people knew about those lands because they had already lived there. We all learned that in grade school. But Christopher Columbus did not discover America in two other ways as well. First, there was no one in 1492 named Christopher Columbus. That name was invented to make the Genoan sailor Cristoforo Colombo seem more familiar to white Protestants in 19th century America. But he also did not discover in America because in 1492, there was no place on the earth called America. What I mean is that America is not and never has been simply a place on the earth. The idea of America from its very inception is not about geography alone, but about power. The first idea of America was invented in Freiburg and Breslau, in a free imperial city in the Holy Roman Empire, today in southwestern Germany. 1507, a map maker there, Martin Wadseebüller, probably in cooperation with a partner, Matthias Ringmann, first used the term in his newly published description of the Earth. The author, in mapping and describing the lands of the southern part of the Western Hemisphere, we call South America, explained that he chose to call the territory America, or the land of Americus, in honor of Amerigo Vespucci, the first European to establish that these lands were not in fact Asia, but a landmass previously unknown to them. In its inception, the idea of America was self-referential. The lands of the Western Hemisphere only had meaning relative to their relationship to Europeans' awareness about and conquest of them. But none of the diverse peoples of these lands, from the Inuit in the far north to the Mapuche living in the far south, used the term America to describe where they lived. In fact, there was no single worldview, language, or economic network tying these diverse peoples together. Even using the term Native Americans to refer to the people before 1492 is problematic because it implies some kind of common characteristics. For Europeans, by the 1520s, America was not a homeland for thousands of diverse cultures, but a place to extract silver and gold, or to cultivate crops like sugar and tobacco to serve the material well-being of competing European states. The invention of America brought with it destabilizing refugee crises and other massive displacements of people. Probably the most famous group of refugees associated with early America were the English Puritans, like those who founded Plymouth Colony in 1620 or Massachusetts Bay in 1630, often treated as victims of the religious intolerance in Europe. But we need to be very careful about exaggerating the case. Historians now understand that Puritan views were only shared by a minority of colonists in 17th century New England, the vast majority of whom came to enrich themselves, not flee persecution. Many colonists are also happily returned home or moved back and forth between Europe and America without any problem. Those colonists who did prioritize Puritan devotion, however, were not so much refugees escaping persecution as idealists who aimed to establish a new Christian utopia. Puritans were not simply victims of a bloody and fanatical state-sponsored persecution by any means. First, by the 1620s, punishments for nonconformity to the Church of England were fines. They were not nearly as harsh as those paid for nonconformity a century before, being hung or burned alive in public. Yes, Puritans were banned from having public worship in designated churches, but many had worshiped very freely in the Dutch Republic nearby, but only grew frustrated there because of lack of economic opportunities offered to them. And finally, the King of England, Charles I, explicitly granted the Puritans permission for the creation of their colonies. It is true that Puritan preachers later drew on biblical themes of exile in their sermons. In 1679, the famed Boston preacher Increase Mather wrote, quote, "There never was a generation that did so perfectly shake off the dust of Babylon as the first generation of Christians that came to this land," New England, he means, for the gospel's sake. Seeing the migration of New England as a mirror for the ancient Israelites escaped from Babylon served as a useful rhetorical tool for the devoted preacher, whose goal was to shame listeners whose religious commitment he felt had grown weak in recent decades. But using biblical metaphor of self-sacrifice was a theme common to many Christian writings. Historians find it among Christians of all stripes everywhere they lived. We should not confuse such rhetoric with the actual experience of persecution and exile. A more straightforward case of Reformation-era refugees who fled to the American colonies were the Huguenot or French Protestant exiles. In 1685, the French king Louis XIV revoked the law permitting Protestantism in France. Some of the 150,000 French refugees who fled moved to South Carolina, New York, and Virginia. However, it was only about 2,000 that moved to North America. And those who did flee were often pushed to do so in the face of xenophobia and mistrust from fellow Protestants, not from Catholics. Most of them had fled first to England, it turns out, where they could worship quite freely, but locals hated them because they feared immigrants might take their jobs or burden their charity systems. In short, while people in the US later created a mythology that said the opposite, in fact, refugees and religious exiles from Europe played a very small role in the history of colonization of the Americas. We find a slightly different situation when we consider Muslims and Jews, or people of Muslim and Jewish descent fleeing to the Spanish and Portuguese colonies. The possibility that heresies might creep into the new colonies provoked deep anxieties among the government and church officials about how to maintain religious purity while engaging in a global territorial expansion. A number of Moriscos, Muslims who had been forcibly converted to Christianity, but who mostly maintained their commitment to Islam, came to the America as slaves, soldiers, and sailors. Once they crossed the ocean, some escaped their masters. These people might rightfully be called refugees. Similarly, conversos, people born Jewish and were forcibly converted, or whose ancestors had been forcibly converted, who fled to the Americas, faced scrutiny when they demonstrated heretical views. The Spanish colonial government established inquisitions in Mexico City and Lima in 1570, and Cartagena in 1610 to hunt down these so-called secret Jews. When judges determined that conversos were practicing Judaism in the colonies, as was the case with Luis de Carvajal the Younger, depicted in a sort of mythological portrait here in 1596, offenders were burned alive. But Jewish and Muslim refugees played a far greater role in the colonial imagination than they ever played in the reality of colonialism. There simply was not enough of them to have much of an impact on the invention of America. Much more significant forced migrations resulting from the invention of America were the massive involuntary relocations associated with the African slave trade. During the time that it functioned, over 15 million people were forcibly moved from sub-Saharan Africa to the Americas. The African slave trade was one of the most historically significant forced migrations in the history of the world, not just for its demographic impacts, but for its cultural, economic, and political implications for centuries. By the 1550s, most enslaved laborers in the Americas were still indigenous peoples. But Africans, mostly people coming from areas between Senegal and Niger, had become a significant part of the labor force. In the Spanish and Portuguese colonies, enslaved Africans worked in silver mines, gold mines, but also on plantations growing sugar and other cash crops. The English, Dutch, and French had all adopted similar systems of enslaved labor throughout their American colonies as well. By the 17th century, tens of thousands of people per year were sold into slavery, often were in gruesome working conditions. The violence perpetrated on individuals to maintain slavery on that massive scale has sent shockwaves through history. Of course, none of these enslaved people understood themselves to be Africans. That concept, like the idea of America, was an import from Europe, and I'll get to that in a few minutes. Enslaved Africans, of course, were not refugees, but forced migrants of an entirely different kind. Refugees are voluntary migrants in the sense that they fled their homes facing persecution or hardship. Their choices, death, physical punishment, forced conversion, or rebellion, were awful. But they were choices. Africans sold into slavery did not decide to leave their homes. Millions of men and women were sold by African traders to European slavers, forced onto ships for periods of 2 weeks to 5 months, and sold off as property in a world wholly unfamiliar to them. The experience was profoundly traumatic. They didn't know where they were or how to get back. One group of runaways fleeing slavery in South Carolina just started walking east, hoping to get back to their homes in the Congo River basin. Another group built a canoe. They knew there was water between them. They built a canoe, hoping to sail back home. Sometimes all the enslaved people had in common with one another was their shared disorientation and oppression. My point here is not to compare which people faced worse conditions in history, but to clarify the difference between refugees, people who faced hardship, persecution, and punishment, from those people who were captured and sold into slavery. Both are forced migrants, to be sure, but the nature of their condition is rather distinct. While slaves were not refugees per se, many thousands of people who fled persecution and oppression of slavery for freedom can properly be called refugees. Runaways, commonly called Maroons in English, formed havens of refugees from slavery in the hills, swamps, and forests around large populations of slaves all through the Americas. The first Maroon communities were established only shortly after African slavery in the Americas started. The earliest case I know of was in 1503 on the island of Hispaniola, today Haiti and Dominican Republic. A Spanish colonist in Cuba, Hernando de Castro, reported in 1543 from the city of Santiago that Maroon communities established in the wilderness were serving as sites of resistance to slavery. Maroon refugees often burned European ranches, killed slave-owning colonists, and rescued enslaved people. Maroon communities arose all through the Americas, in British, Spanish, Portuguese, French, and Dutch colonies alike. They are variously known as palenques, quilombos, macombros, cumbres, laderas, and mabises. In the British colonies, Maroon communities can be found in Jamaica, Carolina, Virginia, Georgia, and elsewhere. The most famous Maroon colony in the present-day land of the United States was the so-called Dismal Swamp on the Virginia-North Carolina border, later made famous for its portrayal in an 1856 novel by the American author Harriet Beecher Stowe. In her book, Dread, A Tale of the Great Dismal Swamp, the character for whom the book is named, Dread, is a Maroon who helped runaway slaves. During more than 10 years of field excavations, Dan Sayers has recovered an archaeologist at the American University, has recovered over 3,000 historical artifacts from inside the swamp. Dismal Swamp's challenging geography has allowed it to host as many as 2,000 Maroons at its height. Mostly Maroon communities were smaller, between 100 and 300 residents, usually located in well-defensible locations that had reliable access to water and arable land for farming. Maroon communities usually had more women than men. The gender difference might simply reflect the fact that men were more commonly sold into slavery in America in the first place as a result of both supply and demand factors that I can explain later. But women played a prominent role in some Maroon communities, including sometimes serving as its leaders, even leaders in military leaders. Historians do not agree about how common it was for Maroon communities to form around coherent ethnic identities. Historian John Thornton argues that that was the most common. Alvin Thompson has argued that most Maroon communities were in fact ethnically mixed. They might have developed a shared language or religious traditions, Thompson argues, but maintained a substantial ethnic diversity. Sometimes Maroons also joined communities of indigenous Americans who also faced enslavement by European colonists. The Mosquito people in present-day Honduras and Nicaragua welcomed Maroon communities fleeing the English Puritans colony of Providence Island in the Caribbean in the mid-17th century. Over the time, the Maroons and the Mosquitoes fused into a single hybrid community. Of course, a central problem facing researchers who study Maroons is that most of the evidence that survives today was produced by European enslavers who had poor understandings of Maroon communities and their identities. As a result, the debate between Thornton and Thompson and others will probably never be fully answered. In some cases, Maroon communities even gained recognition of European states. The Esmeraldas colony of Maroons was established after a slave ship was lost off the coast of Ecuador. By the end of the 16th century, its leader, known as Francisco de Arobe, signed a peace treaty with Spain, which guaranteed his Maroons practical autonomy in exchange for recognizing formal Spanish authority. The painting you see here was commissioned 2 years after that treaty. Maroons could also form strategic alliances with European colonists. Following a 1739 agreement in Jamaica, the Windward Maroons helped British colonists hunt down runaway slaves in exchange for land and limited rights as British subjects. In a few cases, Maroon communities became large autonomous kingdoms of their own. One remarkable example is Palmares in northeastern Brazil. The community was established by runaway African slaves about 1605 or 6. Palmares was apparently Bantu speaking, that is, while all community members did not come from the same region or culture, most came from regions with enough shared linguistic heritage that they could communicate in a language other than Portuguese. Records suggest that more than 10,000 refugees lived there at a given time. Palmares had an elected monarchy, an established social hierarchy modeled on Bantu-style political organizations in sub-Saharan Africa. Its capital city at Massaco had a church, council house, many buildings, and several iron foundries. It became a center for ongoing acts of rebellion to Portuguese rule, and its fortifications were strong enough to repel more than 20 Portuguese invasions between 1643 and 1677. The 715 square mile territory was defended by large spiked fences with gates and a ditch filled with wooden spikes. As in other Maroon communities, sentries stood guard, passwords were required for entry, and spies and scouts warned the community of impending danger. Maroon communities were sometimes places to organize resistance to colonial slavery throughout the Americas. Refugees plotted large-scale revolts. This was the case in Haiti in the 1520s, Venezuela and Panama in the 1550s, Suriname and Jamaica in the 1680s and 90s. The deadliest slave revolt in North America, the Stono Rebellion of 1739, was led by slaves from South Carolina fleeing to join Maroon refugees living in the town of Mose, Spanish-controlled Florida. The Haitian Revolution broke out in 1791 and ultimately topped French rule and led to the creation of the first state ruled by former slaves, counted Maroon among its fighters. The first leader of that revolution, an African man named Dudi Bauchman, was a Maroon refugee who came from Jamaica. While they had poorer military technology than the Euro-Americans, Maroon communities were filled with experienced soldiers who had served in armies back in Africa before being sold into slavery. That's how they got there. In addition, some Europeans provided weapons to Maroons to fight against their imperial rivals. Now, it would be simplistic and false to paint Maroons as heroic champions of abolitionism. While we might imagine Maroons and slaves as having a natural alliance, at times their resentment for one another surpassed their resentment of slave owners. Many Maroon refugees resented those slaves who they felt were unwilling to abandon a life of servitude. Some Maroons even owned slaves themselves. Meanwhile, some enslaved people provided intelligence to slave owners against Maroon refugees. These tensions remind us that dividing up the world into neat categories of heroes and villains simply cannot capture the immense complexity of history. As I said before, none of these Maroons and enslaved people understood themselves as Africans. I want to take a second to dwell on the invention of Africa. This comes from chapter 5, actually, which is closely related to the invention of America. The first people to call themselves Africans were educated people of African ancestry living in the Americas in the 18th century, most of whom had fled as refugees from the brutality of enslavement to areas where they could be free and get an education. For them, being African connected a collective oppression, slavery, with a mythological sense of a shared homeland. Probably more than any act of resistance to mass enslavement, the Haitian Revolution had instilled people of African descent living in the Americas that they could enact world-changing results if they worked together against their European oppressors. In the 19th century, the embrace of African identity grew strong enough in the United States and the Caribbean that it became an intellectual movement called Pan-Africanism. One key Pan-African text from 1915 was W.E.B. Du Bois' The Negro, which told the shared history of Africans on both sides of the Atlantic as people of culture, sophistication, and dignity, but also who faced the shared experience of enslavement and oppression. He also described the roles of Maroon refugees in challenging white supremacy and the cruelty of slavery. However, until Du Bois' day, the diverse people who lived on the African continent did not understand themselves as African. The first Africans, people who understood themselves that way, didn't live in Africa, but were enslaved and freed blacks in the Americas. Another significant kind of refugee that emerged as a result of the invention of America was indigenous people forcibly displaced from their lands. Native peoples of the Americas faced slavery and death far more than expulsion, but as Europeans expanded their colonial conquest in the Americas, forced dislocations were common. You may have heard about the famous forced dislocation called the Trail of Tears following the Indian Removal Act of 1830. The US government forcibly removed Cherokee, Seminole, Chickasaw, and other native peoples from their homelands to a place the government called Indian Country, today known as Oklahoma. The earlier refugee crises of native peoples in the Americas were less coordinated than this. And war and disease destabilized communities across the Americas and refashioned societies altogether. Consider the case of Cusco in present-day Peru, where the so-called Mita system imposed brutal coerced labor on Andean peoples working in the silver mines of Potosí and Huancavelica. Massive waves of refugees began fleeing the harsh system for towns where they were not part of the shared ancestry networks that were used to recruit workers. These refugees, who the Spanish called forasteros, made up 50% of the population of the bishopric of Cusco by 1690. Unlike other refugees, forasteros did not flee from Spanish lands, but moved to faraway towns within the empire where people often spoke different languages to find employment and remake their lives. Actually, Spanish authorities proved relatively willing to tolerate forastero refugees to serve roles that needed filling as disease and harsh living conditions were killing off native populations elsewhere. Forasteros worked as transport and agricultural workers, as artisans and service employees, earning a wage to keep the colonial economy and government running. In the process, they undermined the ancestral ties that had once bound communities together. Though Spanish authorities always talked about forastero refugees as a destabilizing force that undermined their political power, in fact, they helped colonial authorities transform Cusco into an administrative district of the Spanish Empire. Other refugees in the colonial Americas formed new societies altogether. Consider an example from early North America in the mid-17th century. In the Ohio River Valley and the nearby hills, society that archaeologists call the Fort Ancient tradition had maintained a relatively peaceful existence for about 700 years. Fort Ancient people spoke a variety of Siouan and Algonquin languages and lived in egalitarian multi-ethnic settlements of about 250 to 1,000 people. In the summer, farming on the hills of present-day Kentucky, Ohio, and West Virginia, and in the winter, hunting and fishing along the Ohio River. In the mid-17th century, large-scale waves of refugees from the Fort Ancient Society fanned out across North America as their society collapsed. Historians used to believe that the chief culprit of this flood of refugees were the attacks starting in 1677 by the Haudenosaunee, a league of Iroquois-speaking Senecas, Oneidas, Cayugas, Onondagas, and Mohawks. There is some truth to this claim. European colonialism on the coast resulted in massive population losses among the Iroquois as a result of smallpox and measles, as well as declining beaver populations in the face of European hunting. In response, the Haudenosaunee, who had gained early access to the valuable Dutch gun markets, began to attack neighboring peoples to their west to hunt beavers, but more importantly, to take captives to replenish their own plummeting populations. See, it turns out Iroquois worldviews included a cultural mandate to replace dead relatives with captives from other groups of people who would assume that descendant's identity. That fact explains why sudden loss of life due to disease and hunger sparked attacks by Haudenosaunee against their neighbors. In many cases, captives peacefully integrated into these Iroquois-speaking communities. In others, the attackers hunted down refugees across vast distances. This violence often sparked warfare, which resulted in Haudenosaunee deaths, which only provoked more raids. In the 1650s, Wyandots, Neutrals, Odawas, Eries, and other peoples were dislocated by Haudenosaunee attacks. Sometimes large groups of refugees fled for safety among neighbors of a different ethnicity. A group of roughly 600 Wyandots in 1649, for instance, fled to live with the Neutrals. The following year, the Haudenosaunee attacked Neutrals too, who were then forced to flee with their Wyandot guests. In 1669, the Haudenosaunee also began attacking the Fort Ancient villages along the Ohio River Valley. That is, at least how historians used to explain the massive wave of refugees from the Fort Ancient tradition. Recent archaeological and historical evidence, however, has determined that these attacks were not the main cause of the Fort Ancient refugee crisis. It turns out that by the time the Haudenosaunee arrived, the Fort Ancient peoples had already largely abandoned their villages. They had faced major losses due to smallpox and measles, and slaving expeditions by native people called the Okanishi, and a group today known only to us as the Tomahitas, who sold captives to the British as slaves. In the face of these disturbances, many Fort Ancient people simply picked up and left their homeland. By the time the Haudenosaunee arrived, the Ohio River Valley was mostly empty of people. The Haudenosaunee took some of the Fort Ancient refugees captives, and others fled as refugees. By the 1680s, the last of the Fort Ancient villages had been abandoned. For decades, that region simply stood empty of human beings. In the wake of these dislocations, the Shawnees emerged as a series of itinerant refugee communities that sprawled across eastern North America. Scholars are uncertain and divided about the extent to which the Shawnees existed as a coherent ethnic group of the Fort Ancient tradition before the refugee crisis, or emerged only as a result of the crisis out of mixed ethnic groups. Recently, the historian Stephen Warren has convincingly argued that probably both were true. They emerged out of pre-existing ethnic groups that were part of the Fort Ancient tradition, but also easily integrated other peoples. The example of the Shawnee is one of many challenges to the myth, the so-called myth of the vanishing Indian that still exists today, the idea that colonialism erased native cultures entirely. In this case, the Fort Ancient tradition fell apart, but key elements of that culture, values, belief systems, and social structures survived and adapted, even in the face of the dramatic shocks wrought by European colonialism. Today, there are 3 Shawnee tribal governments, all of which lie in Oklahoma. While we might imagine that Shawnees and other Fort Ancient refugees would flee as fast as they could away from the forces of European colonialism, epidemics, gun violence, enslavement, and land seizures, the opposite was true. They mostly fled toward the colonists. Why might that be? Well, you have to put yourself in their position for a moment. They concluded, quite rationally, that the only way to survive in the new world they faced was to get access to firearms. They also knew the only way to purchase guns was to trade for something the Europeans did not have: expert knowledge of geography, languages, and the cultures of the region. Thus, the Shawnee refugees established new settlements along common travel routes or at the borderlands of European colonies. They then became guides, traders, and yes, slavers for Europeans. One group, for instance, emerged as slave traders along the Savannah River near the present-day site of Augusta, Georgia. Another group of Shawnee refugees settled along the Illinois River at a settlement known as the Grand Village of Kaskaskias, about 90 miles southwest of the future city of Chicago. Another Shawnee settlement emerged around Chesapeake Bay, populated in part by some of the people who had already lived in the previous 2 settlements that I just mentioned. Wherever Shawnees reinvented themselves, they again lived in multi-ethnic, multilingual, largely egalitarian communities alongside other native peoples. In the 1720s, Shawnees began moving back to their former homelands in the Ohio River Valley, and other native peoples joined them. In these migrant communities, many Shawnees, embittered by decades of colonialism, began to express a shared Indian identity that imagined these diverse native peoples as being the inheritors of a shared history that bound them together against European colonists. This agreement was broken during King George's War in the 1740s, but by the 1750s, the multi-ethnic communities regained a large degree of autonomy in the Ohio River Valley. These new communities of refugees and other migrants proved a formidable force in North American political developments. Shawnees and their allies played an important part in pan-Indian resistance efforts against the British, including a conflict historians once called Pontiac's War. After groups of colonial rebels successfully revolted against Great Britain in 1783 and formed the United States of America, the new country's leaders quickly began plans to forcibly remove native peoples to the west. By 1830, the new government had grown strong enough in a position to generate a new wave of forced migrants, the removal of native peoples to Indian country called the Trail of Tears that I mentioned earlier. The Shawnee diaspora were among those forced into Indian country. Unlike the Shawnees' earlier relocations, however, This forced migration was not a voluntary, but the coercive act of an expanding state, more like the slave trade than the refugee crises I've been focusing on today. By the time of the American Revolution, Europeans had dominated much of the Americas politically, economically, and culturally for centuries. They enslaved, exterminated and displaced indigenous people. They imported people who did not understand themselves as Africans to the Americas to extract labor in the service of European profit. They captured lands which they treated as resources to be exploited, either for natural resource exploitation, the cultivation of cash crops for export, or to sustain colonialism. In that sense, we see a remarkable continuity from the first days of Martin Wadsworth, who first invented the idea of America. For nearly 3 centuries, the idea only existed relative to European attempts to control this region of the world. But during the Revolutionary War, 1777, Scottish preacher William Robertson wrote the first comprehensive English language history of the Americas, titled simply History of America, which allows us a chance to reflect on the changes that had transformed world history in the past 300 years. And I brought a copy, the original 1777 copy of that book, if you want to come see it, from WSU's library, which is standing right here on the stage. First, Robinson used the term Native American to refer to the indigenous peoples of North and South America. What's interesting here is not just that the term imagines a homogeneous category of people. Many Europeans have been imagining America's indigenous populations as pretty undifferentiated for centuries. And as we have seen with the example of the Shawnee, by the 18th century, some native peoples too were embracing a shared identity in opposition to colonialism, just as Africans were doing. What is different here is the adjective native to distinguish indigenous American peoples from people of European descent who were born in the colonies. Indeed, by the late 18th century, many European Creole settlers, that is, people who were born in the colonies but whose ancestors had come from Europe, were now calling themselves American to distinguish themselves from Europeans. Of course, to co-opt the term American for themselves, they had to stop using it to refer to indigenous people. In the late 1700s, they started using Native American to make this distinction. A second change we can see in Robertson's book relates to the date of its publication, 1777. He wrote it a year after a group of 13 British colonies declared independence from Great Britain. Now, recently, December 26, 1776, and January 3rd, 1777, the rebels had managed a couple of victories in New Jersey under the leadership of General George Washington. Soon after, Robertson stopped writing his book, which was only half done. And that's only volume 1. There's 2 volumes that he finished. So whatever was going to be finished, it was going to be a very, very long book. In his introduction, he explained that the uncertain state of the British North American colonies caused him to abandon his writing. His decision, I think, is telling. Robertson was the first English language author to write the history of America as if it were a coherent whole. Today, we might assume by reading the book that the book was a history of the United States. In fact, I think the Moscow Public Daily News, in advertising my talk, made that same mistake and advertised this talk as if it was maybe a history of the United States, which obviously not. But of course, the United States didn't yet exist. For Robinson, America was an idea about both of these landmasses, North and South, that assumed political, cultural, and economic subservience to Europe. America's coherence for him, that is, was defined by its conquest by Europeans. In fact, the first several chapters of the book don't even cover the Americas. They cover European conquests in Eurasia, because for him, the important part was the conquest, not the place. The future of the relationship between Europe and America, defined by one's relative subjugation to the other, 1777 now looks uncertain. Without a clear sense of the future, he could no longer write its history. That's because history is never just about writing the past. It's always also about how we understand the past in ways that help us navigate the present and the future. Understanding how and why the idea of America was created helps us make sense of some of the massive dislocations and forced migrations that took place from the 1500s to the 1700s in these lands. Within these lands, they were slowly becoming the Americas. Old societies collapsed, new ones formed. Indigenous peoples were displaced. Millions of people who did not think of themselves as African were taken from their homes and sold into slavery an ocean away. And millions of Europeans, including a small number of religious refugees, were emerging as colonial conquerors. In all of these cases, the refugee movements led to the creation of new societies. Refugee crises sometimes destroyed old ways and inspired deep resentments. That is, refugees also refashioned themselves with new identities, new alliances, new cultural forms that also transformed the world. In the years that followed in the United States, meanwhile, the most important refugees associated with the invention of America, African Maroons and indigenous refugees, were forgotten, replaced by myths that America was invented by European colonists fleeing persecution. This new myth became central to forging a national identity for the people of European heritage in the United States. It's not surprising then that the first distinctly American national holiday, Thanksgiving, established in 1870 following the Civil War to bring white Americans in the North and South back together, celebrated the mythical heroism of refugees, even as Americans quietly forgot the other refugees associated with their early history. Many wise critics have pointed out that the term refugee crisis is problematic because it seems to suggest that the refugees are the problem. They are not the problem. The problems are those people who treat them inhumanely in their homes and the people who treat them inhumanely in the places where they go. Migrations become crises when they violate people's sense of what kinds of people could or should live in what kinds of geographical spaces on this earth. And as I've been suggesting today, some of the most important assumptions about who could and should live in what places on the planet were first introduced in the 1500s, and by the 1700s had become so cemented in the way in which people understood the world that they continue to drive many of our assumptions about how the world should operate or does operate today. The invention of these new ideas like America or Africa were accompanied by massive refugee crises as people came to imagine who ought to be living in this or that place on the globe. Now, let me be clear. I'm not suggesting that history tells us we need to open the borders. I'm not making any policy suggestions about refugee resettlements at all. What I am saying, though, is that we risk committing grave injustices when we make any policies unaware of the religious, cultural, racial, economic, and political assumptions governing our sense of place in the world and the legacies that we have inherited, which condition the choices we make every day. I do hope that my work can help others check themselves from the easy lure to categorize members of an ethnic, religious, or national group of migrants according to preset assumptions about who they are, why they're leaving, how they experience their migration, or what possible impacts there might be of their travels. Such historical perspective might allow us all to consider our views on refugees and forced migrations in more thoughtful, more self-critical, and I hope more generous ways. Thank you. I'd be happy to take some questions if there are some.
I can kick it off. Give people a couple of seconds to think about it. So I'm currently reading a book called White Trash. And it is about class, the history of class in America. And it makes a similar argument about the mythology behind the Puritans, rock, and that it was very much created. And so you mentioned that refugees often are fleeing under the definition of refugee, it could be fleeing economic hardship is a reason to be considered that. So how would you categorize indentured servants, which this book argues before the arrival of large numbers of enslaved people we now call Africans, that was sort of the backbone of labor in the country. And we also don't want to remember how many of those folks came to the shores.
Yeah, this is where the definition of refugee can become very, very tricky, right? Because we can imagine. I'm sorry. Yes, the question was how do we understand indentured servants in early American history as refugees or economic migrants, and how do they fit into this picture? And so my answer is that part of the problem with, I think it's fair enough to include them. Part of the problem is that in a lot of contemporary American political dialogue, we often distinguish between refugees and economic migrants, and I think that there's a couple problems with that. One is that we do it largely well. One is that economic migrants tends to focus on people being drawn toward a place rather than fleeing a place. So we're focusing on the wealth they hope to gain as opposed to the hardship they're in, right? And that can sometimes get confusing because people often leave. We focus on the pull factor rather than the push factor, if you see what I mean. Indentured servants often are coming from pretty disastrous conditions. Others might be in relatively stable positions. And so measuring those pull and push factors is really difficult when you get down to the nitty gritty in cases like that. But I think in many cases, refugees might be a fair descriptor of that case. The other problem with push and pull factors in categorizing refugees is that people often present their case in one way, but they have a whole collection of reasons for moving, push and pull factors for moving. So it's sometimes hard to sort out who gets to count. And in that case, I think that humanitarian organizations, they have to be very careful about sorting out. They have to follow rules and set them because they have to determine where the resources go. As a historian, I don't have that burden. I can use more flexible definitions because I don't have to give out aid or make a decision about who gets aid and who doesn't.
I'm wondering about the Maroon community, and if I guess I've heard about them before, but I didn't know, haven't really known about them. And I'm wondering if they influenced the design of communities in those nearby areas, or if they influenced how the country was put together in some way.
The question is, did Maroon communities influence the way the sort of the geography or organization of the colonies? Is that right?
Yeah, more like the political organization, I guess, or how to run a community.
Yeah, in places where Maroon communities were particularly dangerous, Jamaica is a great example. There's particularly strong and militant anti-colonial Maroon communities in Jamaica, and the British government had to maintain. Didn't have to. They chose to maintain a pretty aggressive militaristic defense in protection of their slave owners' property and the colonial lords, so colonial land. So yes, in places where they formed very strong. Same as Palmares is the same example. The Portuguese and the Dutch, when they came, had endless problems with Palmares as well when they showed up and took over. The Dutch took over Portugal or Brazil for a short time. So in those places, they ended up shaping the geography of the colony quite a lot. In places where they formed small, sort of largely independent agricultural communities, they're not playing much of a role in the actual construction of the European part of the colonies. They're playing a role in their own construction of their own worlds. Yeah, in the back. I don't know enough about to say, I'm afraid. I don't know. Okay. A question over here. Yeah, sure. The question is, can I explain the image on the cover of the book? I finished this book just before the pandemic shut everything down. I was in Europe with my wife. I was on a research trip to Europe, and we had been in Germany I was giving some research talks in Germany, and we were visiting a friend in Rome. And I just submitted the manuscript of this book to press. So it was about to come out. I needed to think about what it was going to look like and, doing the production stuff of the book. And my wife had never been to Rome before and really wanted to go to the Vatican and to see the Sistine Chapel. And so we went there, and as we're walking through St. Peter's Square, there's this brand new sculpture that the Catholic Church had commissioned that had earlier that year dedicated, called "Angels Unaware," from a biblical quote from Matthew, and it was dedicated to the history of refugees and forced migrants. There's a passage in Matthew. If you're a Christian, you might well know it about. I was a stranger and he welcomed me, and it comes from that passage. And there's another passage from the Psalms, I think, that it comes from. Anyways, it's different refugees in world history. So we're looking at a variety of refugees. And so I just started taking frantic. Actually, we had to go back. We had to walk back to the hotel and come back. And I just frantically took photos, and sure enough, it was great. A bit of a coincidence, but a great coincidence.
Any other questions? All right. Well, then I say let's give Dr. Spohnholz one more round of applause. Thank you all so much for joining us here at the Kenworthy and in Zoom land. We have recorded this program, so if you'd like to watch it again or share it with a friend, it will be on our YouTube page, the Historical Society's YouTube page, in the coming days. A reminder that we do have one final installment of this How It's Going, How It Started program, which will be about pandemics and what we can learn about current pandemics from previous ones. Very timely. I don't think we'll be done with the pandemic by March 22nd when that program is scheduled. So be sure to join us again. And I guess want to take a quick opportunity, one, to thank our sponsors again, the Idaho Humanities Council and the partnership with Washington State University's Roots of Contemporary Issues program. And I will just say that this is my final public event with the Latah County Historical Society. I have taken a new job, and so I will be leaving the Historical Society next month before the 22nd. And I see so many faces out here of people who have been so wonderful to me over this time. So thank you for indulging me by letting me say thank you for always being so kind to me. And this really is such a wonderful organization, and I'm so excited to see what happens in the future. And the very next thing is on March 22nd, so be sure to be here. Thank you again, Dr. Spohnholz, and we'll see you all later. Have a good evening.